suspect with no alibi, a murder with unknown motive, and the killer is still on the loose. Allison Sloan has no alibi in the murder of her colleague, as she attempts to uncover the motive behind the mystery in order to displace suspicion off of her. The evidence against her continues to mount. Her only hope for finding the truth is a psychic detective, but he's keeping secrets of his own. Together they attempt to solve the murder, but can they find the killer before Allison becomes the next victim?
Chapter 1.
So, you don't have an alibi?
Allison arched an eyebrow. If I'd known someone was going to murder my research colleague, I wouldn't have spent the night home alone.
But you were alone Saturday night between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight?
Yes. Allison enunciated the word to make sure she was clear, since Detective LaGrange insisted on clarification of her initial answer. Saturday had passed like any other. She'd worked a half day at the lab and rode her spin bike in her exercise room at home in the afternoon. Then she'd spent the evening home alone and went to bed alone.
Do you know anyone who might have wanted Professor Balin dead?
Allison frowned. Wasn't that the million-dollar question? She'd been asking herself that question since learning of his death. No. On an academic level, he worked well with others and stuck to his lab. I don't know much about his life. Married and kids are grown, both in careers now, I think. I seem to remember him showing me pictures of grandchildren. Yes, twins.
Did the two of you socialize outside of work?
Allison glanced at the other man in her office. Detective LaGrange had introduced him as Cash McCall, a psychic detective and police consultant. Rather than sit on the opposite side of her desk like LaGrange, Cash roamed her office, looking at her diplomas and collection of elephant figurines on her bookshelves. In contrast to the wrinkled, ill-fitting suit Detective LaGrange wore, Cash sported tailored navy slacks and a pressed white shirt. His black Oxfords were polished to a shine. Allison turned back to Detective LaGrange. We did not have a relationship outside work. I don't know much about his social life.
But you knew him for 5 years?
Yes, professionally.
In 5 years, you worked on research projects and never went out for drinks? Shoot the shit or whatnot? Me and Cash here, we've been professional colleagues for several years now. Closed over a dozen cases. We go out for drinks regularly.
Well, perhaps murder victims promote bonding better than petri dishes. Standing near one of her bookshelves, Cash chuckled. He kept his hands tucked in his pockets as he perused the titles of textbooks. A knock came at the door before it was tentatively pushed open. Vera Myers stuck her head inside Allison's office. Dr. Sloan, is it okay to go back to the lab now? Allison nodded to her research assistant. Not just hers. Vera had worked for Balin, too. The young grad student had already been questioned by the police. She dipped her head before leaving. Detective LaGrange pulled out his phone, flicked through the screen, and then turned it for Allison to see. She pulled her glasses onto her nose as she read what appeared to be a text message transcript. I know what you've done.
Care to explain the text message Professor Balin sent you? Detective LaGrange asked.
Allison suppressed a shudder and kept her tone calm. She needed to explain this to the detective the way she might talk to a belligerent patient. Firm, but don't piss him off. As soon as she learned of Balin's murder, she knew this late-night text would seem suspicious. I didn't see the text until Sunday morning because my phone is set on Do Not Disturb from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. When I saw it, I assumed he'd inadvertently texted the wrong person. I did my morning bike ride and thought I'd bring the text up when I saw him this morning at work.
It all sounds so logical, Doc. But from an investigative standpoint, I've got a Vic who fingered you, and you've got no alibi.
She slid her glasses off and let them dangle around her neck on the gold chain connecting the ends. If her father had taught her one thing, it was to keep her emotions bottled inside of her. The more emotional turmoil within, fear, pain, sadness, the more she was supposed to let those create an impassive shell on the outside. "Let's have another go at logic, shall we?" She steepled her fingers. "Now, you haven't given the exact time of death, just 10 to midnight for my whereabouts. But I do have this text message sent to me at 11:06. If I'm at the scene of the crime, murdering Balin, why is he texting me?"
I most certainly would like to know the same thing,
Detective LaGrange replied, the sap in his voice growing stickier. Allison resisted the urge to tell him to get out of her damn office with his judgmental stare, do his job, and find out why. She knew from her acclimation to Louisiana cultural nuisances that voices tended to grow sweeter as more venom was infused. She continued, "There are 2 possibilities. Balin could have texted me by mistake. My name starts with an A, so I'm first in some people's contact list. The other option is that the killer texted me from Balin's phone."
Why would the killer do that?
Allison sensed her line of reasoning was one Detective LaGrange had also considered. She felt some consolation knowing he hadn't immediately jumped to her as the murderer. Cash leaned closer to one of her shelves, eyeing her green, gold, and purple Mardi Gras elephant figurine. "Either a mistext or misdirection," she said, pulling her gaze from Cash back to LaGrange.
You're saying the killer wanted to throw suspicion on you? Why?
"I assume to keep suspicion off himself."
Himself?
I needed to pick a pronoun. I have no idea if the killer is male or female.
So, how does the killer send a message on a password-protected phone?
Was this Detective Matlock's play dumb routine to get his perp to slip up? Although I've never tested it, I assume facial recognition or thumbprints on corpses still suffice to unlock phones.
Yeah, I can't explain the text message either, but it's very concerning.
I'm innocent, Detective LaGrange. You'll find none of my DNA at the crime scene, and my fingerprints won't be on the murder weapon.
I'll let you know if that's the case when we find the murder weapon.
His eye contact lingered a few seconds.
Well,
Detective LaGrange stood.
If you think of anything else.
He extended a business card to her as he rubbed his bald head with his other hand. Allison set the card down on top of her desk as she also stood. "Do you have any other suspects?"
So far, just you, Dr. Sloan. Don't leave town.
Cash McCall stepped outside Dr. Sloan's office to speak with Detective LaGrange.
I'm going back, Hyde. See if I can learn anything else.
Dr. Sloan didn't have an alibi and didn't seem particularly distraught about her colleague's death, which piqued Cash's interest.
Good luck. Ice Queen in there is liable to eat you alive. Check in with me when you're done.
Hyde plodded down the hallway. Cash stepped back into Dr. Sloan's office. She was still standing behind her desk. She wore a baby blue blouse, navy skirt, brown boots that came over her calves, and an expression of wariness that the interview wasn't over yet.
Why elephants?
He asked. What?
You have numerous elephant figurines. They must be of some significance to you.
Elephants symbolize good luck. Her brisk answer suggested that might not be the real answer, or the complete one.
They can also symbolize fertility, but you don't seem like the type of woman for frivolous superstition.
She crossed her arms, as if to suggest he didn't know a damn thing about her.
You don't have a southern accent,
he noted. I was a transplant to NOLA when I was in grade school.
And then you left to attend college at Loyola, followed by medical school at Johns Hopkins, then back to New Orleans 5 years ago?
What do you do for the police, exactly? Dr. Sloan asked.
I talk to spirits.
Ah, then you should be able to clear my name. Professor Balin can tell you who killed him, and it won't be me." Cash detected condescension in her tone, but it sounded forced. So she was being defensive, which, combined with no alibi, was highly suspect. He was accustomed to negative attitudes from skeptics about his medium ability. Instead of challenging her disbelief, he gave Dr. Sloan his most charming smile.
If only it worked that way. Sometimes it's that simple. But sometimes, as in the case with Professor Balin, the victim doesn't linger as a spirit to resolve his own murder.
Cash had spent time at the crime scene and encountered neither Balin's ghost nor a ghost who'd witnessed the murder. "Well, that's unfortunate." Her voice sounded genuinely disappointed. She brushed long, straight strands of mahogany hair off her shoulder. She had an oval face and full lips with vibrant, youthful skin. Put her in blue jeans and a t-shirt, and she'd pass for a grad student, like her lab assistant, Vera.
So, you didn't see Balin socially? Were you hiding a romantic relationship?
"He's 20 years my senior." She sounded insulted by Cash's insinuation. Cash shrugged, slipping his hands back in his pockets.
He's a renowned researcher, and you're a beautiful woman. It wouldn't be the first time.
He let his voice trail as he picked up a carved ebony elephant to inspect it. Dr. Sloan walked to him, took the elephant, and re-shelved it. "The first time what, Mr. McCall? A woman slept her way to advance her career?"
No,
"Because I've published 20 papers and have my own NIH funding." She stood nose to nose with him, a feat made possible by the heels on her boots and pushing up on her toes like a ballet dancer. Without those extensions, she'd be about 5'6". Her flushed cheeks enhanced a pair of livid blue eyes. He liked the fire in her, hot and spicy like a crawfish boil. But he didn't like that he'd upset her. He didn't usually upset women until the third date, if they made it that far. Of course, suspects were entirely different.
Dr. Sloan.
He lowered his voice, balancing her anger with his calm.
I was trying to convey that you're beautiful enough to have any man you wanted, even tempt a married man with a rational mind. I'm aware you are intelligent and successful on your own merit.
He'd read her online biographical sketch. College done by age 21, medical school, residency, and fellowship done by age 30, and now she had her own lab and research funding. Her eyes roamed his face, as if absorbing the sincerity of his words and expression. He noticed her eyes were a soft blue, haloed by a silver, moonlit glow. "Okay," she rolled her shoulders. "I'm admittedly defensive after being accused of my colleague's murder. It's like I can't mourn him with this worry hanging over me." She leaned back against her desk and crossed her arms.
Yeesh.
She was wound tighter than a keening banshee. Yet she'd finally displayed some emotion around Balin's death.
Not accused,
Cash clarified.
just a suspect.
She cocked her head to one side. "It's still unnerving. I'd like to mourn the loss of a colleague and scientist who contributed his expertise to the field of lung surgery. Instead, Detective LaGrange has me wondering if I'll be publicly disgraced by leaving my office in shackles." Cash noted the sincerity in her voice. Her initial stiff demeanor and lack of display of emotion about Professor Balin's death while Hyde had interviewed her had made her seem suspicious, when in reality she was hurting and worried. Perhaps all those years as a physician dealing with death had taught her how to quarantine her emotions. Cash knew his casual demeanor and charm often caused suspects and witnesses to lower their guard and open up to him. In this case, Dr. Sloan's feelings worked in favor of exonerating her. Maybe.
He won't cuff you and haul you into the police station. Not having an alibi isn't motive.
Did she have motive? She wasn't sleeping with him. But what about professional jealousy or competition? Yet Cash had researched her before this meeting. At 32, she was a rising star in the research dominion. She didn't need to eliminate anyone to maintain her upward trajectory. Self-defense, perhaps? Did Balin have a dark, dangerous side? If he did, it hadn't surfaced in any of Detective Lagrange's interviews thus far.
She didn't do it,
A baritone male voice said. Cash looked toward the window of Dr. Sloane's office, where an apparition of a man stood. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a full head of immaculately combed hair. He wore a three-piece suit and polished shoes. The translucent ghost turned his gaze from the window to Dr. Sloane before landing on Cash. Cash looked at Allison and gave a slight bow.
"Will you excuse me?"
Without waiting for a reply, he turned and left her office. Cash walked through the hallways of the research building adjacent to the medical center. When he took the exit outside, he found a quiet quad with trees and a water fountain. A November breeze scattered the stiff, fallen leaves of nearby magnolia trees. Turning, Cash locked eyes with the ghost who'd followed him.
"Dr. Allison Sloan's deceased father, I presume?"
Chapter 2. Cash blinked under the morning sun, streaming through live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. No one was within earshot of his conversation with the ghost.
"What gave it away?"
The spirit asked. His voice was a slow, sad ebb. Another beat slower, and he could audition to be the next Eeyore voiceover.
"The eyes,"
Cash replied.
"I'm not sure if that makes you extremely observant, or if I need to be concerned about you being romantically interested in my daughter, Mr. McCall."
I don't date suspects. I'm sure it's against my consulting contract somewhere.
"I just told you she's innocent, not a suspect."
Are you giving me your blessing to pursue her romantically?
"No."
Cash chuckled. There seemed to be no humor in this spirit. He suspected this was the man's normal behavior, and he wasn't so grave simply because he was beyond the grave.
"I'm not after your daughter,"
Cash reassured him, resisting the urge to point out that Allison was over 30 and didn't need an overprotective father.
"Good, because I can't help but notice you've dated a lot of women over the years."
Hey, personal boundaries, counselor. Cash kept his tone light. He wasn't offended, because he understood ghosts had the ability to glean information about people and events.
"I don't suppose you could use your supernatural powers of perception to tell me who killed Professor Balin?"
Cash asked. Mr. Sloan frowned in disappointment.
"No."
Disappointed at the situation, or his inability to see the killer? The lawyer didn't strike Cash as the type to express disappointment in his own limitations.
"Well, perhaps you'll want to stick around, in case you have some insight that arises. Or just if you want to ensure I don't fondle your daughter."
The ghost scowled. Cash suspected Sloan had been a man of power and prestige in his lifetime, and people didn't converse so casually with him.
"I'm joking. Lighten up, and help me solve a murder mystery."
Cash had one other murder mystery to solve, and that was what unfinished business with his daughter was keeping Mr. Sloan tethered to the world of the living. Allison sank back in her chair. Why had she let Cash McCall get under her skin? People usually didn't rile her. Sometimes she was unflappable to the point of being called aloof. Between having a no-nonsense lawyer for a father and working in a medical field that discouraged emotion, she'd learned to school her feelings. She hadn't let the real detective see her frayed nerves, but the psychic detective, whatever that meant, had her boiling defensive in 1 minute and nearly in tears the next. Maybe it was those golden eyes matching that thick, dirty blonde hair. But what kind of charlatan consulted on murder cases under the auspices of talking to ghosts? Her phone chimed with a reminder. Right. Back to the lab. She had lungs to harvest. After sweeping her hair up in a bun, she walked through the winding hallways of bland linoleum, beige walls, and identical rows of wooden doors. She stopped at room 2042 and entered. She pulled on a lab coat hanging inside the room. Vera Myers was standing over the research organoids. Her eyes looked puffy, and red splotches spotted her cheeks and neck. "Are you okay?" Allison asked. The lab assistant shook her head, blonde bob with frayed curls swaying. She sniffed. "I can't believe he's dead." Allison nodded. According to the news reports, Professor Balin had been stabbed in an abandoned building downtown and discovered by a homeless person. Stabbed and left for dead. The single stab wound might not have been enough to kill just anyone, but Balin had been on anticoagulation therapy to treat blood clots in his lungs he'd acquired after an overseas flight to a research conference. Detective LaGrange had asked Allison if she knew why Balin would be at an abandoned building. She had no idea. "Do they know who did it?" Vera asked. Allison put on her reading glasses and slipped on a pair of vinyl gloves with steady hands. She was reeling on the inside, but portrayed calm on the outside, a long-standing habit. They do not. And if suspecting her was any indication, the police were clueless. Vera started to grab a pair of vinyl gloves from the cardboard box with shaky hands. "Why don't you take a few days off?" It wasn't a question. The poor girl didn't need to be trying to do lab work after the death of her mentor. "But there's so much to do," Vera protested. "I'll take care of it. I'm not working in the ICU this week." "Okay." Vera hung her lab coat by the door as she left. Allison moved a piece of lung tissue from one container to the next to prepare it for slicing and making slides for staining. "Dr. Sloan?" Allison looked up to see Cash McCall standing in her lab. She sighed, suddenly wishing she hadn't dismissed Vera, so the extra body would be a buffer against his interrogation. "Yes, Mr. McCall? You won't find any elephants in here." She continued her work. He chuckled, a damn infuriating sound she actually enjoyed. "Call me Cash." She paused her hands in midair and looked up at him. Something in his demeanor had changed since she saw him only 15 minutes ago. Had he decided she wasn't a suspect? Or was this his way of luring her into a false sense of ease, to garner an inadvertent confession? She had nothing to confess, but she'd keep her walls up nonetheless. "What can I do for you, Cash?" He grinned as he leaned against the counter. His playful eyes seemed to be considering her question in a way that had nothing to do with the investigation. Confused, she turned her attention back to the lung samples in front of her. Cash watched Allison work. Since seeing her in the office, she'd pulled her hair up in a loose bun and put her reading glasses back on.
"Always working,"
her father's ghost said.
"She works too much. That's my fault. I'm proud of her accomplishments, but I wish I'd taught her to enjoy life more."
Cash wondered about Allison's relationship with her father, but he wouldn't talk to the ghost in front of Allison. Cash had become adept over the years at listening to ghosts while interacting with the living who remained unaware of a paranormal presence just 5 feet away.
"What's your work?"
Cash asked the physician. When he'd tried to skim content from her publications in a preparation for the interview with Detective LaGrange, he might as well have been reading hieroglyphics. Allison talked as she worked. "These are organoids, small lung replicas. I'm studying the effects of acute lung injury. I expose the tissue to irritants and study damage on a cellular and molecular level."
"Irritants?"
"Any number of things. Lipopolysaccharides, which are released during sepsis and cause acute respiratory distress syndrome. diacetyl, which is in e-cigarettes and can cause popcorn lung, mold, which can cause hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and the list goes on. She explained with enthusiasm, and not as though she was trying to talk over Cash's head. He didn't understand most of what she said, but liked listening to her talk.
Did you say popcorn lung?
Yes. In the 1990s, some workers in microwave popcorn manufacturing plants were suffering from bronchiolitis obliterans, an inflammatory lung injury from the airborne diacetyl, hence popcorn lung. She hesitated. Named for how it was discovered, and not because your lungs turn into anything resembling popcorn.
Ah, so you injure your miniature organs and then study them? Then what?
She looked up at him with a slight smile, as though pleased at someone's interest in her work. We figure out how to reverse it. It's all in a petri dish, so to speak. But cures start with bench work.
So have you had any breakthroughs? Anything that might make a competitive researcher upset?
Allison stiffened. Upset enough to kill Balin? No. Believe me, if I knew who to cast suspicion on to alleviate your suspicion of me, I'd send you in their direction.
I don't suspect you.
She shot him a disbelieving glance. What changed? Bending down, she continued her work.
A ghost vindicated you.
Allison gave a humorous chuckle without looking up. Okay, well, put in a good word for me with Detective Lagrange.
I'll do that,
Cash said. When she glanced at him again, he kept unwavering eye contact until she broke it. Cash took a step forward.
The problem is that if you're innocent and this murder is research-related, you could be in danger. That's my concern as well,
her father said.
I don't know who the killer is, but I know it's somehow connected to the research.
I'm sure there must be other possibilities. Allison sealed her samples in plastic cases and snapped off her gloves. Cash struggled.
No bad debt? No jealous lover? No terminal illness? No family discord?
A theft turned violent? She asked.
Nothing valuable is missing on his body.
She leaned one hand on the counter and took off her glasses. Shouldn't you be with Detective Lagrange? Detecting?
I don't have to be with him to be working the case.
I thought you don't suspect me anymore.
I don't, but I still think the murder is related to Balin's research.
Mr. Sloan huffed.
Stop inching your way closer to my daughter. What are you playing at?
What was Cash playing at? Allison didn't like him, didn't trust him, and took his medium abilities to be a joke. So why did he want to win her over? Because he liked a challenge, and because of an unexpected and probably misplaced masculine desire to keep Allison safe.
Why don't you show me the research Professor Balin was working on? Explain it to me. Maybe something will emerge.
Allison raised her arms. You're looking at it. This is our workspace. There's no secret underground lab.
What about his work computer?
In his office.
Can you show me?
I don't know his password.
I'd still like to see it.
She narrowed her eyes at him, but didn't back down. Is this the part where I'm supposed to ask for a warrant? Cash noticed she was so close, he could reach out and snag her by the white collar of her lab coat. He tucked his hands in his pockets.
If you want to obstruct the case and look like you're hiding something, sure.
Okay, let's go snoop. Cash followed her out of the lab, hoping her father didn't see Cash looking at her backside, and the gap of skin showing between where her skirt ended and the top of her boots began.
Are these your days? You go back and forth to your lab?
I'm 70% funded, which means I do my research 70% of the time. The remaining time, I'm an intensivist.
Sounds intense.
He hadn't a clue what type of specialist that made her. She glanced at him, with a quirk of her lips. An intensivist is someone who works in the ICU, an intensive care unit. He considered the proximity of the hospital just across the quad from the research offices.
So, outside of the lab, you're actually saving lives in real time.
It's not so dramatic as you make it sound.
Reality or humility?
Instead of answering him, Allison reached a door and tested the knob. Locked. The name plaque on the wall read, Professor Alan Balin. After withdrawing her phone, she punched in a quick number. Hi, this is Dr. Sloan. I'm in the Charter Building. I'm here with Detective McCall, who's with the police department investigating Professor Balin's death. He would like to enter the professor's office. Yes. Okay. Thank you. She disconnected the call and turned to Cash. Security will come open the door. Chapter 3. Allison had data to analyze, papers to write, and emails piling up. But she knew all of that would have to wait until Balin's murder was solved. Could there be a link between his research and his death? It seemed improbable. They weren't curing cancer. While their research in acute lung injury was important, it wasn't worth dying over. She could settle the matter with this police consultant by showing him how benign all of Balin's files were. Probably. She leaned against the wall as they waited for the security staff to arrive. So, where is all of the mysteriousness of the psychic consulting you do? Other than mentioning ghosts, you haven't put on much of a show. Cash leaned on the wall opposite her, bracing himself with one knee bent, foot on the wall. His demeanor seemed so casual, like he could lure a villain into forgetting he was actively hunting a killer.
I'm not a showy guy,
Allison chortled. I doubt that. From what she'd seen, he was smug and knew women found him attractive.
Is it me you don't trust, or men in general?
I'm a woman of science, Cash. I don't mix well with a man earning a paycheck by claiming to see ghosts. He'd smiled when she'd used his first name addressing him.
Does that unwavering reliance on logic stem from having a rigorously rational father?
Her jaw tensed, but she didn't reply. Cash softened his voice further.
Perhaps even a joyless man like that would tell you to relax and have a little faith in the inexplicable.
I highly doubt that. When the medical center security guard arrived, Allison showed him her badge, and he let her inside Balin's office. The security guard nodded and left. Cash proceeded to do exactly what he'd done in her office. Explore the shelves with framed photos and rows upon rows of journals in chronological order. Allison watched him circle the room, waiting to see if he'd start touching objects, close his eyes, and claim to be connecting with the other side. Instead, he remained a silent observer, absorbing his surroundings. He moved with ease and a certain relaxed stealth, making her wonder what sort of work he did prior to becoming a police consultant.
Allison?
Had he asked a question while she was watching him move? She swallowed. Yes?
I'm going to log into his computer now.
Cash sat at Professor Balin's desk in front of his desktop computer. I don't know his password.
I do. Your Phantom told me.
Allison walked around to stand behind Cash. No way he'd be able to guess the password. The password requirements at the medical center mandated uppercase and lowercase letters, several characters, and numbers. She couldn't remember her own password for a week after she was forced to change it every 3 months.
Rockstar_PhD70, he spoke as he typed.
That's ridiculous. No sooner were the words out of her mouth than the computer desktop appeared. Cash began systematically opening files. How'd you do that?
A spirit, though not Professor Balin's, has agreed to help the case. Sometimes spirits can glean information. In this case, he was able to tell me Professor Balin's password. I'm not often so lucky.
You're saying there is a male ghost helping you as we speak?
Yes.
Cash continued scanning files, seemingly unperturbed by her tone drenched in skepticism.
He perhaps has his own agenda, but our objectives align for now.
Does he have a name?
T.S.
Do you not know his name or not want to share it?
I don't want to share it.
Last name Elliot? Are you going to start spewing poetry?
No, but you're welcome to keep guessing.
She shook her head. What did she care if he wanted to keep his ghost's name a secret? She didn't believe Cash anyway. There had to be some other explanation for the password. Perhaps Balin's wife had told Detective LaGrange, who told Cash. The psychic consultant opened Balin's email and logged in. Allison leaned forward to watch, feeling an uncomfortable sensation of voyeurism in looking at a colleague's email. She was unable to turn her gaze from it. Yet 40 minutes later, she thought she might fall asleep while staring at the mundane contents of it all. Committee meetings, mandatory continuing education, manuscript edited with track changes, travel arrangements for the next American Thoracic Society meeting, and the list went on. His email was as dull as hers. Allison slipped her glasses off and rubbed her eyes. I'm going to leave you to this tedious work and go for an afternoon caffeine pick-me-up.
That sounds wonderful.
Cash pushed himself up from the desk. Allison took a step back and faltered. Nothing in her statement had been an invitation for Cash to join her, but that hadn't deterred him. How was she to rid herself of this man? After leaving Balin's office, she stopped by her own, Cash following, and picked up her purse. She checked briefly to make sure her inhaler was inside.
Medication?
Cash asked. If Mother Nature invented it, there's a 50-50 chance I'm allergic to it. I don't go anywhere without my inhaler or my EpiPen.
You have asthma?
She nodded. Allergic asthma since childhood.
Must have made outside play dates difficult.
True. I did dance and gymnastics instead of outdoor sports growing up. He kept pace with her through the hallways and down the stairs to the main floor.
You bristled at the mention of your father. Tell me about him.
Cash's words broke the silence. She never talked about her father, but Cash's request was so straightforward, as if he was asking directions, that the words were leaving her mouth before she could stop herself. He was a great lawyer, so they say. I never saw much of him. Most of my memories are of a busy, hardened man who didn't make time for the family he created. You've heard the Harry Chapin song, Cats in the Cradle? He was that father. Always promising and never delivering. I have those elephants he gave me, but not much in the way of memories of quality time together. After fellowship, I returned to New Orleans to spend more time with him, but fate and an aneurysm decided otherwise. When they reached the coffee stand, Allison ordered 2 Café Cubanos. She didn't ask Cash what he wanted, but since she was paying and answering all of his questions, she didn't think it rude to order for him in hopes of accelerating the uncomfortable encounter. Was it uncomfortable, though? The words about her father had flowed with uncharacteristic ease. Perhaps that was Cash McCall's true supernatural power, creating an environment where people dropped their walls and talked about themselves. After all, who'd suspect judgment from a man claiming to see ghosts?
And like the song, now you're leading a busy life.
Cash sipped his coffee. I suppose so. I think my father tried a few times to reconnect with me in fellowship, but I had grants to write and 12-hour shifts to work.
Is that why you're 32 and single?
She led Cash outside to the quad, where the fresh air did more to revive her than the coffee. Is my personal life relevant to the investigation?
Everything is relevant,
he deadpanned. She arched an eyebrow of doubt, but answered his question anyway. I'm still single because I work long hours, and no man wants that, except maybe military and pilots. But I move in different circles, so I'm unlikely to meet those men. I never started a family because it's not fair subjecting a family to my lifestyle.
You think you'll be a disengaged parent like your father was?
They walked the perimeter in the quad. It wouldn't be fair to pursue a relationship if I couldn't know the outcome.
Come now, Doctor. No one knows the outcome with any certainty. And as a researcher, surely you know that experimentation is the only route to finding your desired outcome.
Is that how you justify promiscuousness? Experimentation?
Why would you call me promiscuous?
You give off that vibe. She drank her Cafe Cubano. He shook his head in baffled amusement.
What vibe? You and your father really are cut from the same cloth.
What do you mean by that?
What vibe?
He countered. A flirtatious, no woman can pass this up vibe. Do people really fall for that?
I'll have you know that many women find both me and my psychic detective abilities alluring.
Well, I guess there's that. The world is full of gullible fools to take advantage of. Cash walked beside Allison, feeling the icy prickle of her words.
You deserved that,
her father said.
You did make her confide in you about me. If you're gonna dig up painful memories, you better be prepared for the backlash.
Duly noted. But Cash wasn't deterred. He looked at Allison.
I've helped the police solve over a dozen cases without taking advantage of anyone, and I assure you that none of the women I've spent time with ever felt taken advantage of.
Allison kept silent. Remorse or reproach, Cash wondered. Cash was normally unfazed by unbelievers. He didn't waste time trying to convince them spirits existed, and that he was one of the few people who could see them. The people in his life who mattered believed him. His parents, his sister, and Detective LaGrange. Cash's dilemma was that Allison's father still roamed the world of the living, and if Cash was going to be able to help the ghost move on, he suspected he'd need Allison's cooperation. He'd need to make her a believer eventually. Over a dozen cases? Her tone had transformed from cool distaste to warm curiosity bordering on awe.
Yes.
How?
Since you don't believe in ghosts, there isn't much point in describing the process to you, he teased. Besides, the process has been different for each case. Sometimes the apparitions are the victims, sometimes friends or family of either the victim or the killer, and sometimes the family of a future victim.
Cash glanced over at Mr. Sloan, who glided beside his daughter, listening intently to their conversation.
Only once did the victim outright tell me who'd killed him. But obviously that won't hold up in a court of law. The onus is still on Detective LaGrange to prove it, but it helps if he can focus his efforts.
Detective LaGrange believes in ghosts?
I don't think he'd agree to that, but he does believe in me. I helped him solve a campus murder case at a university his niece was attending. That went a long way to build rapport.
How did you get started on something like this? I don't imagine psychic detective is listed on job boards. Cash tried to gauge if Allison was being sincere and was surprised to find she was.
After my criminal justice degree, I started working as a private investigator. Ghosts are harbingers of secrets, or have access to them, but not always the ones you want. Sometimes my cases overlapped with police investigations. I gave Detective LaGrange key information to nail a career-making case for him when I could have claimed solving the case as my own. The next case he struggled with, he asked me to come on board and help. We signed a consulting contract.
Do you still do PI work too? She rotated her wrist, remixing the contents of her coffee.
Yes, but I have enough business and a good reputation that I can be selective about what I agree to do. I don't do cheating spouses.
What's your favorite type of case? She asked.
Missing persons. They don't always have a happy ending, but giving people closure is rewarding.
Yeah, she smiled, eyes brimming with surprised delight. I can relate to that. Sometimes my greatest accomplishment in the ICU is helping families let go of their loved one or honor the patient's wishes. The ultimate outcome is someone's death, but when it's done correctly, I'm ending the patient's suffering, giving them death with dignity, and shortening the dying process, giving everyone closure. Cash stopped and turned to regard Allison. Despite her skepticism about his medium abilities, she was trying to connect with him on a personal level. Her reaction was vastly different than most women. In his experience, a dichotomy existed. Women were either intrigued by his paranormal abilities, and it became a topic of every interaction in a brief yet mutually satisfying relationship, or women were repulsed by his exploitative career, preying on those fool enough to give credence to a man claiming to talk to spirits. Enter Allison Sloan at stage right, who fit neither category, and he couldn't read her enough to know if the connection she was attempting to bridge represented an interest in him. "Are you okay?" Allison asked.
"He's damn smitten is what he is,"
her father grumbled. No one had ever asked Cash his favorite type of case, and certainly no one had ever made an attempt to relate to his type of work.
"Yes, I'm good,"
Cash finally answered, ignoring her father.
"I find I'm enjoying myself more than I should, and I'm keeping you from your work."
"Oh, okay."
"Thank you for the coffee and the company."
He began a backward retreat. She raised her Café Cubano in salute. "You'll let me know when you find the culprit?"
"Yes, of course."
Cash turned and walked away.
"Well, you can't just leave her unprotected,"
Sloan protested.
"You want me to protect her or stop ogling her. You can't have it both ways." "And why not?"
A man in scrubs, passing Cash, glanced warily at Cash, seeming to talk to himself. Cash sighed and pulled out his phone.
"Who are you calling?"
Sloan asked. Cash put the phone up to his ear as he continued walking toward the parking lot.
"No one. I'm pretending to talk on the phone while talking to you, so as not to look like I'm having a psychotic break." "You're still walking the wrong direction."
"I'm going to my car."
"But Allison..."
"Allison has the security of her lab, so unless you can tell me there's some imminent danger,
I'm going to take a minute and collect my thoughts about the case. I also need to check in with Detective LaGrange."
Sloan frowned.
"No, nothing imminent." "How about you stay and keep an eye on your daughter? If anything concerns you, let me know and I'll come back. Also, let me know if you glean anything helpful to the case." "Okay, I agree to your plan."
His voice oozed reluctance.
"And then you'll be back by the time she gets off work?"
Cash reached his car and stopped to stare at the translucent, needy lawyer as he continued to hold the phone to his ear.
"You want me to chaperone your daughter?" "Like a protection detail,"
Sloan clarified, straightening his already impeccably straight tie. Cash dropped the phone into his pocket.
"You realize I'm neither a cop nor am I armed. And even if I tell the detective that a ghost wants protective surveillance on Dr. Sloan, he can't submit the request based on the statement of a psychic consultant." "Just you."
Sloan had morphed into the bargaining lawyer.
"An attacker would be much less likely to try anything with you by Allison's side. So I come back and then what? I invite myself to her house for dinner?"
Sloan scoffed.
"Please. I'm sure a dedicated bachelor like yourself knows exactly how to invite himself into a woman's home. Except this time, you'll have a clean conscience, since you're putting yourself between her and danger, and not between her sheets."
Cash jerked the car door open.
"First of all, my conscience is clean. Secondly, I don't put myself anywhere I'm not wanted. Lastly, how about you turn that ghostly power of perception off me and try and find out who the killer is so you can clear your daughter's name?"
Cash sat down in the car. He didn't need a judgmental ghost, and his personal life was his own. He certainly didn't need the spirit of the father of a woman he'd never laid hands on looking down his nose at Cash's life choices. Chapter 4. Allison walked back to the lab with mixed emotions about Cash's abrupt departure. One minute, they were unexpectedly connecting on a professional and personal level, and the next moment, he'd made a clean getaway. Perhaps he'd been enjoying himself more than he should for her position as a suspect in the case. Probably so was she. It was good that he left. Those friendly eyes and warm smiles were easy to lose herself in, and she had work to do. When she arrived back at her office, she checked the clock. 3 in the afternoon. Barring no further distractions, she may be able to put the finishing touches on one of her manuscripts and upload it for submission. An hour and 15 minutes later, Allison pressed the submit button. She leaned back in her chair and rolled her shoulders several times. The little mail icon on her desktop monitor stared at her. She knew her inbox would be overflowing with emails from the day, as she hadn't yet looked at it. But she also knew, once she started in on it, the rabbit hole of emails would devour the rest of her day. She could go back to the lab and work with the organoids some more. The lab. Her joint working space with Professor Balin. Now, the lab belonged only to her because someone had murdered her collaborator. Murdered. Allison shuddered. And Cash McCall was concerned Balin's death might be research-related. What possible connection could there be? Nothing had revealed itself on his computer or email. His lab notebook, maybe? Balin was always scribbling in a little black book. Allison assumed they were notes about his research, but it could be quiche recipes for all she knew. She'd never felt inclined to snoop through any of his notes. Until this very moment. She walked back to the lab and began to search for the notebook. She'd opened and closed these drawers hundreds of times, but today she did so while snooping, and it felt oddly intrusive. She found nothing suspicious in the lab, and no notebook, which wasn't unusual. He might simply have taken it home with him, or it might be in his office. Allison walked back to Balin's office, winding through hallways perpetually lit by long, fluorescent ceiling lights. The building was quiet except for the hum of those lights. The lab techs who worked in these walls usually clocked out by 4 p.m. because they typically started their days early. The slight squeak of her boots on the linoleum created an eerie sound. It had never seemed eerie before now, but she'd never been walking alone after the murder of a colleague, as she'd contemplated the possibility his murder could be related to his research. The speculative link brought her own personal safety into question. When she reached Balin's office, the door was still unlocked from her trip there earlier with Cash. Cash McCall, who had her on edge now, thinking about murder motives buried in a little black book. She sat down in Balin's office chair and swiveled aimlessly. Were you hiding something, Alan? If he was, and it was research-related, why wouldn't he tell her? Because he was rockstar PhD? Arrogance wouldn't bring him back from the grave. After leaving Allison, Cash pulled his car into the parking lot of Audubon Park. As it was Monday, the zoo was closed, and there wasn't much foot traffic in the area. Whenever he needed to clear his head during a case, he would find a place to park and walk. He phoned Detective Hyde LaGrange.
What the hell, Cash? You abandoning me to work the case alone while you hook up with that dynamite doctor?
No, I've been working the case too.
Okay, don't get snippy. Did she turn you down? Is that why you're humorless?
I don't hit on suspects.
Yeah, I know that. But usually when I give you crap about being a ladies' man, you play along. What's different?
Cash walked the trail of the park under a late afternoon sun. He ran a hand through his hair. LaGrange was right. Allison and his father's ghost had Cash off his game.
I'm hearing some spiritual concerns that Dr. Sloan may be in danger. Did a ghost tell you that? Hyde asked.
Her father's ghost.
Huh.
Yeah. We were discussing the possibility of the murder being research-related. Nothing turned up in an hour of searching the professor's office and desktop files, but I'll keep digging.
Do you think Dr. Sloan is hiding something?
No, and neither does her father. Hyde snorted.
'Cause Daddy would never cover for his little girl.
I've never known a ghost to lie. I suppose he could be withholding information, but his concern for her safety seems genuine. Can you put a watch on her?
Because you say her father's ghost is worried? No. You've got to find me something more substantial than that.
Cash kicked a fallen twig from a live oak off the paved path. What'd you discover while I was at the research lab?
Tech has scoured Professor Balin's home computer and cell phone. No affairs. His finances aren't great, though.
Oh?
He's been living beyond his means. College tuition for kids, big mortgage, BMWs, country club membership.
Anyone take out a new life insurance policy on him?
No, but the existing one would cover all that, plus funeral expenses.
So his wife is a suspect. Cash continued to walk.
Always. Except for her solid alibi of being out of town with one of the kids. But there's more. On a chat app, the professor was conversing with someone named Techie25. Most of the conversation was deleted, but our guys found a snippet where the professor says he's gonna back out of a deal.
What deal?
Don't know. He doesn't specify. But then Techie25 says, we need to meet.
Sounds ominous. It also worked in Allison's favor. Cash didn't think she'd refer to herself as a techie.
It does. It could also be nothing more than turning down a contractor for a kitchen remodeling. But the fact that it's a semi-hidden chat room with no real names seems sketchy.
Definitely sketchy, Cash agreed. Hyde sighed.
You want to run that by your new ghost sidekick? See if he gets any vibes from it?
Yes. He's currently with his daughter, though. Cash didn't think Sloan would take kindly to being referred to as a sidekick. Cash was more apt to call him a pain in the...
Oh, how unfortunate for you. You need to go back to the doctor. Well, when you see her again, see if Techie25 has any meaning to her, but not in a way that might tip her off.
Got it.
And watch your back, Cash. If she's our killer, I don't think her father's gonna stop her.
In Cash's experience, ghosts couldn't do much to affect the physical world, but that didn't matter in this case. It's not her.
Oh? You sure enough to bet your life on that?
Cash bit his lip, thinking of the message Balin had sent. I know what you've done. And Allison had no alibi. Hyde let out a chuckle.
That's what I thought. Back to work, Romeo. And call me with updates.
Hyde clicked off. After the call with Hyde ended, Cash continued to walk the park, thinking about the case. Sloan appeared.
Are you coming back to protect Allison?
Cash could tell by the sluggish tone of Sloane's voice that there was no immediate danger attached to his question.
I will.
He stopped and sat on top of a wooden picnic table. He and Mr. Sloan were alone in this part of the park. Cash looked expectantly at the man.
My daughter was home alone when the murder happened, just as she said.
Well, you can't be her alibi, so you'll have to give me more than that. Sloane's brow furrowed.
Like what?
Who done it?
I don't know who killed Professor Balin.
Did he have enemies?
Everyone has enemies.
Strike and move to rephrase. Who were his enemies?
I don't know.
Did he ever argue with anyone?
Not that I saw.
Have you seen anything suspicious?
No.
What exactly do you do with your time here on Earth? Cash had to ask, since clearly Sloan was not particularly observant about his daughter's environment.
I check on Allison from time to time.
The ghost's voice held an edge, as if challenging Cash to harass him about watching his daughter.
Easy, counselor. This isn't a court of law, and you're not on trial.
Cash suspected the "from time to time" meant several times a day. Had he been following his daughter aimlessly since his death?
But Allison could end up on trial, and she's innocent,
Sloan said.
Why, if she's innocent, was she defensive and prickly in her office toward the detective?
Cash asked.
That's what you're supposed to do under pressure. The more emotion you feel, the tighter you control it. It's called being professional.
Cash ignored the derogatory tone, insinuating that he wasn't professional.
Maybe in a court of law, but not if you want to convey innocence in the murder of a colleague. You're suggesting Allison melt into a hysterical puddle?
Nothing so extreme, just a little sadness, a few tears. They worked together for several years. Sloan crossed his arms.
Well, I didn't teach her to be a sap. She's a strong woman. Accelerated college degree, top of her class in medical school, research grants right out of fellowship.
Her resume is very impressive. Cash dipped his head slightly. Sloan gave a curt nod of approval for Cash's sincere compliment.
Makes for a lonely life, though,
Cash added gently. Allison's father's eyes flashed before he seemed to realize Cash's demeanor was not judgmental. Sloan deflated slightly as his shoulders sagged.
I suppose I taught her that, too. Not making time for relationships.
The regret in his voice was thick and sticky as molasses. Cash hopped up from the picnic table.
Well, let's solve a murder, and you'll feel better. I'll go check on Allison.
Sloan nodded before vanishing. Cash strode to his car, slid inside, and headed back to the hospital. He needed to figure out how to explain not only arriving back a few hours after leaving, perhaps he could brainstorm more questions about the investigation, but also how to stay attached to Allison. He really didn't want to try to stay awake all night on some stakeout from a parked car, and he was certain her father wouldn't settle for her spending a night unprotected until the killer was caught. In Balin's office, Allison opened drawers and ruffled through papers, receipts, business cards, printed protocols, drafts, and notes. Nothing caught her eye, not that she would know what suspicious documentation looked like. She also didn't see Balin's notebook. Standing and stretching, Allison decided to abandon her fruitless search. The police would find the killer.
"Oh, Dr. Sloan?"
Allison turned to see Vera Myers standing in the doorway. "Hi, Vera. I thought you went home."
"I did, but then I remembered I needed to process the surfactant from yesterday."
"Okay."
"Did the police learn anything else?"
"I'm sure if they did, Detective LaGrange wouldn't share it with me. Besides, it's only been a few hours." Allison wouldn't tell Vera the police suspected her last living superior of murder. Vera seemed worried enough without adding that piece of information.
"It's still scary to think his killer is out there somewhere,"
Vera said. Scary, yes, but Vera didn't need Allison substantiating her fears. She already looked like a terrified rabbit, ready to jump out of her skin. "You're safe," Allison reassured her, despite her own discomfort walking down the hallway in isolation only a half hour ago. "There's security here, and they'll escort you to the parking garage if you want."
"Yeah, I'll do that. Okay. I'll just be here a few minutes in the lab, and then head back home. Are you heading out soon?"
"I just have a few things to wrap up. And, Vera?" The lab assistant turned back to her. "Take a few days off. If there's anything that needs follow-up in the lab, just make me a list, and I'll take care of it." When Vera left, Allison took one last look around Balin's office. Her gaze fell on the peace lily by the window, lit by the setting sun. Balin loved that plant, watered it and repotted it. She'd even caught him talking to it on occasion. Maybe she could take care of it for him. It would be a way to keep his spirit alive on campus. Ugh. Not alive in the sense that might resonate with Cash McCall. Cash. He was an intelligent and attractive man who could make a great living without discrediting himself by claiming to see ghosts. So why did he? Did he like the reactions people had in meeting a medium? Allison had spent a great deal of time as an ICU physician dealing with death and dying, and never had she suspected anyone of turning into a ghost. Her fingers ran over the smooth veins of the leaves on the lily as she thought of Cash's alluring smile. As she shook off images of him, her focus landed back on the plant. Tucked behind the pot was a little black book. Allison chewed her lip. Well, it hadn't made it there by accident, and certainly appeared to have been stashed in a hiding spot. Not terribly stealthy, but not readily apparent to the casual observer. Such secrecy might mean nothing. Balin could have been guarding his research notes, or that award-winning quiche recipe, and not hiding the identity of his killer, or a motive for murder. So why was her heart pounding as she reached out and grabbed the book? After opening it, she skimmed the notes, most of which looked related to his lab work and some of their shared projects. Her fingers touched something harder, a card stuck between the pages. The thick stock paper was folded in half like a thank you card or birthday card, but the front was an abstract design of swirling colors with no words. She unfolded it. Allie. Balin always called her Allie. I owe you an explanation. Let me begin with, I'm sorry. I've made a terrible mistake. The note ended abruptly. Mistake? If there had been a lab error, he wouldn't have gone through the trouble of writing a note. He would have just walked down the hall to her office. What was so awful he would handwrite a note? Lost grant funding? A breach of institutional board review protocol? Did he publish a shared project without including her in authorship? I'm sorry. Had the man ever apologized for anything? She looked back at the book in her white-knuckled grip with her fingers pressed to the leather. Fingerprints. She had no alibi for the murder of Balin Saturday night. Now she held a card written by the murder victim apologizing to her for something. And her fingerprints tainted his most prized possession. She needed to uncover the killer, or the police were going to arrest her. Chapter 5. Cash flashed his police consultant badge to the young security guard who let him back into the research building after hours.
I can find my way back to Dr. Sloan's office. Thanks.
Cash waved as he left the guard behind.
You came back.
Mr. Sloane's ghost, prim and proper, but wearing an expression less despondent than usual, appeared beside Cash.
Reporting for guard duty, sir. Don't mock me.
Lighten up.
How is she?
Cash strode down the hallway. He couldn't imagine being confined to such a dreary building filled with laboratories. But then Allison had said she alternated this work with working in the ICU, so perhaps it was another change of pace. Plus, she could escape to the quad for fresh air when the South Louisiana weather cooperated.
She's fine,
Sloan said. Cash reached Allison's office and peeked inside the room.
Where is she? Professor Balin's office.
Oh? That's not suspicious at all, Cash teased. Allison's father scowled. Grinning, Cash turned and walked toward Balin's office. When he angled to enter, Allison ran into him. A flutter of paper filled the air in a flurry. Oh my gosh, Cash, I'm sorry. She dropped to her knees and began scooping up the leaflets filled with handwritten notes. Her hair looked disheveled and her cheeks flushed. Cash turned back to the ghost with a smirk to emphasize how awfully strange Allison was acting for an innocent woman. The crease between Sloane's eyes deepened. Cash chuckled.
It's fine.
He bent and helped her stuff papers back into a small black, leather-bound notebook. "I'm glad you're here," she said, still breathless. After standing, she smoothed her shirt. "I have to tell you something."
Okay, take a deep breath. You look like you've just run a 100-yard dash.
She put one hand up to her heart, as if to feel how fast it raced. Nodding, she took 2 deep breaths, but didn't yet appear at ease. Cash took her gently by the elbow and led her back to her office.
Did you find something?
After they entered her workspace, Allison closed the door. She reached into her purse, withdrew her inhaler, and took 2 puffs of the medication back to back. Cash leaned against her desk, worried about her present state. She paced, occasionally rising to her tiptoes. Ballet. She mentioned being a dancer as a child. She must have done ballet. He briefly imagined waltzing on a dance floor with Allison in his arms. She'd be graceful, provided her asthma didn't flare. As she paced the room, presumably letting the medication take effect, Cash watched strands of hair wave around her face. "I did find a clue." She set the little notebook on her desk, but kept hold of a small greeting card. "But the problem is... She hesitated and stopped pacing. "Why are you back?" Cash considered the question. The truth?
I wanted to see you again.
What her father thought?
To protect you from a killer at large.
What Cash actually said?
I'm still following leads. Now, what clue?
Allison fidgeted with the card. "I want to tell you because I think I trust you. Weird ghost issues aside."
Why in the world would she trust you?
Her father piped in. Cash wanted to point out to the uptight attorney that he obviously also trusted Cash. Why else would Sloan want him watching over his daughter?
I'm trustworthy,
Cash added, casually. "The problem," Allison continued, "is that the clue... Well, here, read it." She thrust the small card at him. Cash opened it and read it twice before asking,
What's he sorry for?
"I don't know." Her voice sounded pleading. "But it looks like motive, doesn't it? Like I had a reason to want Balin dead."
Do you?
"No." Her blue eyes flashed as she threw her hands up in the air. "But I've no alibi, and now this."
Where did you find the note?
In his research notebook, in his office.
Why'd you go back into his office?
She flopped into her desk chair and ran her hands through her long brown hair, tugging out what remained of her bun. "After you left, you had me contemplating your theory that his death might be research-related. I figured the best place to find out would be his notebook. He carried it everywhere, and he was always writing in it."
Did you learn anything from it?
Cash walked to her mini-fridge in one corner, pulled out a small bottle of chilled water, and set it before her. She looked like she needed something stronger, but the water would have to suffice. "No." She took a gulp of water with a look of gratitude. "I found that note and panicked. Maybe if I have time to go through each page, I'll find something."
Okay, let's do that.
She lifted her head and looked into his eyes with something like surprise and adoration. "You're not going to call Detective LaGrange to haul me downtown?"
Should I?
"No." Her brow furrowed in a cute expression of disapproval.
Well, you happen to have a ghost who put in a good word on behalf of your innocence.
Which Cash felt was a much better reason than, "I think you're innocent because I'm attracted to you." "Okay, well, please thank him for me." Cash sat in the chair across the desk from Allison.
Are you saying you're a believer?
"No." But if your ghost tells you I'm innocent, then I'm going to thank him. Cash wasn't going to tell Allison that the ghost actually belonged to her. Not yet, anyway. He put his elbows on her desk and leaned across.
I'm hungry. Let's grab a bite to eat and go through the notebook. Then I'm your proof that you didn't tamper with anything.
Will you get in trouble for that? Cash leaned back with a shrug.
We aren't withholding evidence because we have yet to determine if it's evidence. Besides, if I solve Lagrange's case, all will be forgiven.
Her expression brimmed with gratitude, causing Cash to wonder if he could earn more than just dinner with her. But as soon as that thought crossed his mind, he dismissed it. They were chaperoned by his father's ghost, and she was a suspect in a murder investigation. Allison drove Cash to Clancy's restaurant on Annunciation Street. There were no available tables, so they took seats at the far end of the bar. Allison set her purse and the notebook down on the marble countertop. She couldn't believe she'd confessed everything to Cash. When she turned to leave Balin's office, she'd vowed to tell no one. She'd planned to solve the case alone. Then, as soon as she saw Cash, she knew she couldn't keep it from him. She wouldn't be able to look him in the eye and keep her composure, as she had with Lagrange. And why was that? She could keep her composure during an ICU cardiac arrest and deliver tragic news calmly. But Cash McCall walks in, and she turns into a bumbling fool. It must have been caused by all the worry about being accused of murder. It had nothing to do with his friendly eyes, or slight upward curl of a full set of lips.
Penny for your thoughts?
Cash asked. Allison cleared her throat and opened the notebook. I should start looking for clues. Cash placed a hand on hers, stopping her from turning pages.
And we will, but go ahead and order first.
The bartender arrived, and Allison ordered a water and comfort food, seafood gumbo. Cash ordered iced tea and blackened catfish. After the bartender poured their drinks and moved to other patrons, Allison opened the notebook to examine it with detached objectiveness. She pulled on her glasses from around her neck and rested them on her nose. Cash's calm demeanor and belief in her innocence infused her like a cool tincture, soothing her angst. Her calm composure wrestled her frayed nerves and won. Cash scooted his bar stool closer to look at the book with her and grunted.
A doctor with neat handwriting.
Rockstar Balin was very meticulous. His attention to detail was one of the many reasons he was so successful. Was successful until someone snuffed out his life.
It's clearly legible,
Cash said.
But I don't understand any of it.
She turned the pages after each inspection and gave Cash the Cliff Notes version. Meeting notes, inflammatory cascade, proteins, immunoglobulins, and markers he's testing or wants to test. Here's a batch of tissue sample he tested for different inflammatory markers. She continued to flip as she sipped the water the bartender had provided, all while keenly aware of Cash's shoulder touching hers and his smell of cedar. By the time the food arrived, they'd worked their way through half of Balin's little black book. With the smell of seafood and sassafras wafting in the air, Allison felt ravenous. I haven't eaten all day. I rode my indoor spin bike, came to work, heard the news about Balin, and met with Detective Lagrange. After you left, I worked. She took a spoonful of gumbo into her mouth.
Can't survive on Cafe Cubano alone. You need to make more time to care for yourself.
I biked.
Yes, but everything else about your day seems hectic and rushed. And I get the impression, despite the tragedy, the workflow you described is more normal than not.
She narrowed her eyes at him as she chewed another bite. How was this man so perceptive? That must be his paranormal skill, the power of perception. Maybe his uncanny ability to read people made him seem psychic. Perhaps he was more mentalist than medium. So, you lead a balanced life? She asked.
I'm very balanced. elliptical machine for cardio, yoga, fasting, meditation.
A tall blonde in a skirt approached the bar.
Cash McCall, you never called me back.
The woman's voice was part seduction, part pout, and all silky southern drawl.
Loretta, good evening.
He stood politely and kissed the cheek she thrust at him. Without acknowledging the woman's blatant feelings of rebuff, Cash turned and introduced Loretta to Allison.
Loretta, this is Allison. Allison, Loretta.
Allison pondered at what point she and he had become Allison and Cash to each other, and no longer Dr. Sloan and Mr. McCall. The transition had seemed comfortable and effortless. Loretta, feigning surprise a woman accompanied Cash, managed to smile and a wave.
This is a business meeting,
Allison assured Loretta, who visibly relaxed.
Cash is ruling me out as a murder suspect. He's still deciding.
Allison suppressed a grin when Cash narrowed his eyes at her. Loretta blinked rapidly and took a step back.
Oh, well, Cash, you have my number.
When Loretta left, Cash sat back down.
What was that for?
What?
I already explained I no longer think you're a suspect.
Oh, dear. It's nice to hear him repeat that. Allison shrugged.
Well, this way, Loretta isn't under the misconception that you and I are here together. You're free to call her back.
I won't call her back.
The firmness in his voice surprised Allison, but she wouldn't press for clarification because it was none of her business. Cash explained anyway.
Loretta and I had a nice night together. I'm straightforward with women I spend the night with. If I'm looking for a lasting relationship, they would know it. She came over here, knowing you and I were having dinner, and probably suspected something more, which means she came to upset at least one of us.
Allison stirred her gumbo lazily, mixing rice, roux, and shrimp.
I'm not upset. She didn't interrupt anything, so what's the problem?
Her intentions were malicious. That's a character flaw I don't like.
Allison mused. She pointed the tip of her spoon in his direction.
Do you suppose if you dated her before sleeping with her, you might have picked up on undesirable character flaws?
Cash gave her a crooked grin as he took a bite of his catfish.
Where's the fun in that?
Allison groaned with an eye roll to avoid a laugh that might encourage him. Cash finished his meal as Allison opened Balin's notebook again. Cash wanted to tell Allison how much he enjoyed her company, but it was inappropriate under the circumstances. He also wanted to have a private conversation about her father and why he was still following her around 5 years after his death. Such a discussion might stir unwanted memories. He didn't want to cause her pain. But could he ease it? No, too soon. First, he needed to gain her trust. Cash leaned closer once again. He liked the proximity to her, even if she'd insinuated he was a promiscuous bachelor. Since she didn't move away or squirm, he suspected she didn't mind his closeness.
You don't have to sit so near to her,
Sloan grumbled. He stood on the opposite side of the bar counter, looking out of place in a backdrop of hundreds of bottles of booze.
You said yourself, you can't read what's written.
Cash leaned in and read from the page Allison skimmed.
Malignant organoid matrix.
He glanced up and winked at Sloan, who pursed his lips in aggravation.
Yes.
Allison drew the word out in a perplexed tone.
But that's my project. Balin wasn't working on this with me.
What was the project?
An oncologist who specializes in lung cancer approached me about using our lung organoids to propagate tumors.
Meaning?
She pulled off her glasses, dropped them around her neck, and looked at Cash.
The oncologist arranges for us to get samples of tumor cells, either from a biopsy or resection of the cancer. We inject it into our lung organoid and let it grow. Then the oncologist has as much malignant material as he wants for testing. Mostly, this was a feasibility study, meaning can we do it on a handful of cases, and will the tumors stay viable? Cash tried to grasp the significance of what Allison was saying, but it eluded him. She must have interpreted his expression, because she continued. There's a practical implication. Let's say a patient has a biopsy, and they're not a candidate for curative surgery. They get first-line chemotherapy and immunotherapy. What if they fail that treatment, or can't tolerate it, but the pathology sample is all used up from initial testing?
They'd have to have another biopsy.
Right. Which isn't lacking risk or expense. Meanwhile, if the patient's tumor from their initial biopsy or surgery had been stored and growing on an organoid matrix, then the patient's own cancer cells can be tested and retested for mutations to determine the next line of therapy.
Like backing up a hard drive.
Yeah.
Why would Balin take notes on your research?
Allison slipped her glasses back on and scanned the page. I don't know. He's got notes on tumor types, genetic markers. She turned the page. DNA extraction, environmental temperature. He shouldn't have been recording any of this. He's not on the research protocol.
What if the oncologist working with you found out? Could he have been angry enough for murder?
No way. Preston is the nicest guy. Look. She turned her gaze back up to Cash. Even if I'm a terrible judge of character and wrong about the oncologist, if he wanted to ruin Balin, all he'd have to do is present this evidence to the Institutional Review Board. Balin would face disciplinary action and disgrace.
What if the oncologist found out about it but didn't have proof? After all, you're the one who found Balin's book.
Preston would have come to me about it.
Preston?
Preston Waters. Cash pulled out his phone. What are you doing? She asked.
Detective LaGrange needs to interview Dr. Waters in light of this information. We should also get that notebook to him.
Can I copy it first? These pages are my work, too.
Sure.
Cash slipped out of his bar stool, glancing back at Allison as he walked away. She closed the book and strummed long fingers along the black leather cover.
She's been betrayed,
her father said, following Cash as he walked outside Clancy's restaurant. Cash nodded. Sloan sighed.
Balin's theft of her work is one more piece that makes her look guilty. And even if you believe her, how is the word of a psychic detective going to redeem her before a jury of her peers?
Cash didn't have a satisfactory answer. Allison was in a quicksand of trouble. No alibi. An accusatory text message. An incriminating handwritten note. And now, motive. Chapter 6. Cash called Hyde and updated him on the notebook and Allison's research.
Balin stealing research only makes Dr. Sloan look more guilty.
Hyde pointed out the obvious.
Except she was genuinely surprised and crushed 5 minutes ago when she discovered his deviousness.
Cash paced the entryway outside the restaurant lobby. He suddenly remembered he hadn't asked Allison if she knew who Techie 25 could be.
And she just happened to discover the espionage in your presence? I haven't given Allison much space today.
Literally. At the bar, she hadn't seemed uncomfortable when he'd scooted closer, all in the interest of the investigation. Oh, but she smelled like warm vanilla.
Can't imagine why,
Hyde said.
Because I'm investigating.
The murder? Or something else about the doctor?
Cash chose not to dignify that with an answer.
Where are you on your end?
I went back to talk to the wife because we found some suggestive text messages.
Suggestive of murder?
Cash asked.
Suggestive of her having an affair.
Oh?
Yeah. She swears it was all only over the phone and internet, nothing physical. But then she got very defensive. She said she suspected Dr. Sloan of having an affair with her husband.
Based on what?
Women's intuition that Dr. Sloan wanted her husband.
So, no proof?
No.
Cash rolled his shoulders.
So basically, she's pointing the finger at Allison because she's a younger, attractive female? and Mrs. Balin wants to cast suspicion off herself. Seems that way, but it's another strike against your girl. Not my girl. You spent all day with her. You're on a first-name basis, and you claim her father's ghost is talking to you. What do you want me to call her? I'll get back to you on that. For now, she's not my girl and not a suspect. She's a suspect to me. Get me that notebook, first thing in the morning.
Hyde clicked off.
She's not your girl,
Allison's father stated. Cash kept the phone to his ear as he scowled at the apparition.
Yes, I'm aware of that, but right now, I'm the only one looking out for her. So how about you hold your judgmental stares and condescending tone?
Sloan opened his mouth in what looked to be a moment of protest before closing it. He looked in the direction where his daughter sat, and then back to Cash.
You're right. Thank you, Mr. McCall, for looking out for her.
Allison sat at the bar while Cash talked on the phone. She knew her predicament grew more glum by the hour. If the case against her continued to mount, she'd need a lawyer by this time tomorrow. Her father would have been perfect for the job, and if she was his client, he might actually treat her with some importance in his life. With her career on the line, he'd have sufficient motivation to help. The career she'd worked so hard to achieve, in part to impress her father. Every nod of approval at good grades, every small acknowledgement to his work colleagues about his daughter being pre-med, his daughter in medical school, his daughter the doctor. So much for tiny morsels of recognition. Now her father was gone. And what did she have to show for her years of hard work? A career that could be ruined at any moment, and a lifetime of loneliness, stretching out as long as a double-stranded helix. She opened her wallet and signaled the bartender for the bill. It wasn't in her nature to wallow in self-pity. She made a difference in patients' lives, and her critical care staff were a cohesive group of colleagues. She had a different type of family with them. Even if she was taken into questioning by Detective LaGrange, NOPD only had circumstantial evidence on a crime she didn't commit. Of course, a jury need only to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. When Cash rejoined Allison, she'd already paid for the food and was standing, hoisting her purse onto her shoulder as he approached. "Ready to go?" she asked. No. He wanted to stay, set the book aside, and share a bottle of Cabernet over conversation. Then they could make plans to go out dancing, like there wasn't a killer on the loose.
Yes, absolutely.
He forced out the words. They walked to her car on the curb under a starry night, surrounded by the familiar smell of mossy trees, old wood, and brackish water. Allison unlocked the car, and they climbed inside. "I'll take you back to the medical center visitor parking lot to get your car." She started the engine. Sloan cleared his throat from the back seat.
"How about we get you safely home? I can get a ride back to my car after that,"
Cash said. Sloan said,
"You need to find a way to stay with her."
Her father's tone was uncharacteristically pleading, until he added,
"In a gentlemanly fashion. I'm always a gentleman."
"Are you?" Allison mused, oblivious to the rest of the conversation.
"Always."
As they drove, Cash felt at a loss for words. If he was trying to seduce her, he'd be charming his way into her home, gentlemanly-like. But he wouldn't mislead Allison. He liked women, and liked spending time with them. But all interested parties knew what the expectations were. The expectations with Allison were undefined. He wouldn't finagle his way into her bed, both because she was a suspect to Hyde, and because Cash didn't want a one-night stand. He wanted... hell, he didn't know. For starters, he wanted to find Balin's killer, so their opposing roles of suspect and psychic detective could be removed from the equation.
Allison drove into the garden district before pulling into the driveway of a 2-story white brick home with a decorative balcony supported by white pillars. Based on the number of windows, it was probably at least 4 bedrooms. Small yellow floodlights lit a white porch. The house sat on about a 1/4 acre of manicured land.
That's a lot of house for one person.
It was my father's home. She exited the car and shut her door. Cash took a deep breath as he opened the passenger side door, deciding he'd tell her the truth now about her father and why he needed to stay with her.
Danger.
The single word, spoken by the ghost of Timothy Sloan, had Cash out of the car and sprinting around the back of it at lightning speed. "You killed him!" a gray-haired woman screamed from the end of the driveway as she raised an extended arm and fired a gun. Chapter 7. Cash leapt, tackling Allison to the lawn as the gunshot rang out. He spun with her in his arms, trying to take the brunt of the force of the fall. The impact knocked the breath out of him. He looked over his shoulder, keeping himself between Allison and the assailant. The short woman screamed again, pale-faced and wide-eyed, before getting into a car parked on the road. Tires squealing, she took off down the road.
Allison, are you okay?
"I'm okay." Her breathing was quick, and Cash could feel her rabbit-fast heart rate beating against his chest.
Mrs. Balin dove off the deep end. I need to phone this in.
That meant letting go of Allison, which he didn't want to do until he was certain she was okay. She closed her eyes for a moment as she leaned her head against his chest, breathing quickly.
Do you need your inhaler?
She shook her head. "No, I'm okay." When her breathing slowed and she sat up, he let go of her and pulled out his phone.
Hyde, we have a situation.
An hour later, Cash paced in Allison's driveway. Allison sat on her front porch, looking devastated as her father's ghost sat beside her, unable to offer physical or emotional support. In the yard, police walked the perimeter while crime scene investigators combed for evidence: the bullet, the casing, the tire marks.
Is Balin's wife in custody?
Cash asked. Hyde stood still with his arms crossed over a protuberant belly.
Yeah, she is. This doesn't exonerate Dr. Sloan.
Cash knew that, even though it infuriated him. Dispassionately, he understood Mrs. Balin's actions didn't make her her husband's killer. Why attempt to kill another woman if Mrs. Balin was the killer? If she wanted to throw off suspicion, a public confrontation would make more sense. Shooting at Allison, ambushing her when she thought she'd be alone, wouldn't result in more suspicion of Allison. Also, the murder weapons were different. If Mrs. Balin was going to kill her husband over a supposed affair in a fit of rage, which she demonstrated she possessed, why hadn't she used the gun to do so? Hyde shifted his weight as calculating eyes watched Allison.
Maybe Dr. Sloan should stay in a hotel tonight. She might feel safer after what happened here.
Cash stopped pacing.
Don't insult my intelligence, Hyde. You don't give a damn about Allison's safety. You want to make sure she doesn't have the opportunity here at home to hide evidence, while you're busy getting a search warrant.
Hyde pulled his shoulders back and turned a hard expression on Cash.
Don't let this case get between us, Cash. We work well together.
Then show me a little faith.
Hyde stepped closer.
Trusting you don't alleviate me from doing my job. I trust you're on the level and not getting defensive because you want to sleep with her. Aside from that, I need proof.
Hyde turned and began walking away from Cash.
I thought it was innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around,
Cash called after him.
And I want that little black book,
Hyde tossed back over his shoulder. Cash walked over to the porch, letting his frustration with the situation seep out of him. Allison didn't need his negative emotions spilling onto her. He sat beside her.
They're almost done here.
I can't believe she shot at me. I can't believe she thinks I'm capable of killing anyone. 3 people have suspected me of murder.
Just 2 now.
Well, judging by Detective Lagrange's glumpy glares, he thinks I coerced you or seduced you into thinking I'm innocent.
Seduced?
Cash put his elbows on the stairs behind him and stretched out his legs.
I could be so lucky.
He waited for her father to chide him, but Sloan said nothing. He was probably still shell-shocked from his daughter being shot at. Cash sighed.
Look, you've had a bad scare. Why don't you pack an overnight bag? I've got a spare bedroom.
Before she could object, he added,
But I'm trusting you not to seduce me. I've got a reputation to uphold.
She choked out a laugh. Your chastity is safe with me.
Well, that's a damn shame, but I'll manage.
He pushed to his feet.
How about that go bag?
He extended a hand and helped her stand. She grimaced slightly. Cash suspected she suffered some bruising from getting tackled by a man, though she wasn't openly complaining. He'd tried to cushion her as much as he could, but his main concern had been moving her out of the trajectory of the bullet. Allison walked inside and disappeared up the stairs.
I haven't seen her comfortable around men the way she's comfortable around you.
Careful, counselor. That almost sounded like approval. Sloan cracked a smile.
Maybe with your charisma, you should have been a lawyer.
I like what I do.
You're good at it.
Okay, now you're just buttering me up for something. Sloan raised his hands in mock surrender.
No ulterior motive, though saving my daughter's life has modified my perception of you.
Oh? Cash raised his eyebrows hopefully.
Not enough for that.
Cash chuckled.
Do you often save lives during your cases?
No. Cash rubbed the back of his neck.
That's a first. What's a first?
Cash turned back to the porch to see Allison at the door. She'd packed fast, and he wondered if that was the product of pulling call nights for the ICU.
First time fighting with Detective Lagrange.
Truthfully, this case represented many firsts for Cash. Protecting a suspect, dodging bullets, an overprotective father, and a woman he was connecting with on a personal, yet not intimate level. Are you all set? Cash asked.
Yes.
Allison leaned against the passenger side door as Cash drove her car to his place. If she wasn't so exhausted, she might contemplate how 12 hours ago she didn't like the man. Since then, they'd found common ground, made efforts toward solving a murder, and had dinner together. All of that had been followed by him saving her life. Before the police had arrived at the house, Cash had tried to downplay the event, saying Balin's wife would have had to be a good shot to accurately hit a target at night at the end of a driveway. He even showed Allison that the trajectory of the bullet didn't align with where she'd been standing. By Allison's own calculations, the bullet wasn't far off, and Cash sprinting toward the woman's target probably threw off her aim. So, either way, he still saved her from being shot. And how had he known? Allison hadn't seen the woman approaching up the driveway until she screamed. But Cash had already been dashing toward Allison before Mrs. Balin unleashed her battle cry and revealed her presence. Had the ghost warned Cash? T.S. The same ghost who told Cash that Allison was innocent. The same ghost who knew Balin's computer password. And Allison had heard part of a one-sided conversation between Cash and his ghost on her porch. She listened to the steady hum of the tires on the road. She couldn't work through everything now. Her brain needed to power down for the night. What if Cash's ghostly interactions were a manifestation of a medical condition? What if a brain tumor was causing him to hallucinate? That wouldn't explain the password and the dodging bullets. She'd have to table this puzzle so she could process it logically another day. She closed her eyes, but saw visions of Balin's wife aiming a gun at her. Allison shuddered. Cash moved his hand from the steering wheel as if to take her hand, but redirected it to adjust the rearview mirror.
Tell me about the elephants.
The elephants? She sat straighter.
In your office. They're very beautiful.
My father bought them for me, usually birthdays and Christmas. When I was 6, we took a trip to Thailand, and I fell in love with elephants after I got to pet and ride them.
Cash smiled, as if pleased he'd learned the true meaning of the many elephants in her office.
She added, "They are good luck, also. The raised trunk signifies the showering of luck."
She frowned.
I don't feel very lucky these last 12 hours. Lucky to have you looking out for me, I suppose.
He reached and took her hand in his. Warm reassurance spread through her.
You're from Louisiana, so you know what lagniappe is?
She added.
Extra.
You're my lagniappe. Lucky lagniappe.
Like cream filling in a king cake, or beignets at Café du Monde, Allison thought. Cash was something rich and sweet and splurge-worthy. He was something extra in life. Maybe the something extra Allison had been missing. The something extra worth rearranging the rigidity in her life to enjoy. When they reached his condominium, Cash parked the car. They walked through card access security to enter the building. A friendly front desk clerk waved and greeted Cash as Mr. McCall. Allison followed Cash to the elevator. Once on the 5th floor, they entered his 2-bedroom condo. The space was tidy and warmed with potted plants by every window.
This is nice,
she commented. Cash closed the door, clicked the deadbolt, and walked to the kitchen, where he poured 2 glasses of water. He handed her one.
Why don't you shower? And that'll give me time to make up the bed in the spare room.
She took her bag and water to the bathroom, where she enjoyed a hot shower. After toweling off, she slipped into yoga pants and a t-shirt. She left her hair towel-dried. She found Cash in the kitchen explaining to no one that
chamomile tea will help Allison relax.
She cleared her throat. Cash turned to her, a smile lighting his face. If he kept looking at her that way, she might stop caring that he talked to himself.
I made tea.
He set the mug down at the counter across from the stove.
Chamomile, I heard.
Thank you. She leaned on the counter, wrapped her hands around the cup, and smelled the light aroma.
Yes, well, ghosts aren't like vampires, who can only be invited inside someone's home.
Cash took a sip of his tea, as he shot a menacing glare at nothing but the refrigerator to his right.
And sometimes they linger incessantly, even when you've assured them you're protecting the person they're looking out for.
Allison cocked her head to one side.
Why do I get the feeling most of what you just said wasn't directed at me?
Your ghost is a bit overprotective of you.
Oh? So T.S. is my ghost now?
Allison chuckled.
He's always been your ghost. He's the one who alerted me to the danger at your house.
But you're the one who risked your life.
Cash stared at his mug, dipping his tea bag up and down. Allison shook her head.
I'm still replaying the shooting. How on earth did it come to this? I was always cordial with Mrs. Balin, and for her to think me capable of...
Her voice trailed as she lifted the tea to her lips and drank the soothing liquid.
She's hurting, and obviously more than a little unstable,
Cash offered.
She probably replayed events in her mind. Times her husband worked late with you. Times maybe the two of you traveled to work-related events together. You shared a side of him she wasn't a part of. Maybe Mrs. Balin's feelings have been festering for a while, and maybe her husband dismissed them, or overlooked them entirely.
Allison let the logic of Cash's words sink in and offer comfort. Perhaps Balin's wife suspected something,
and felt the murder was confirmation of her feelings. She sat down her cup and shuddered. And the real murderer is still out there.
Cash came around the counter and took her hands.
And you're safe here. We'll investigate more tomorrow.
Allison felt the warmth from Cash's touch spreading up her arms. His gentle gaze roamed her face, gaining a new heat and desire the longer his eyes lingered on hers.
Allison, I really want to kiss you right now. My only hesitation is the awkwardness of having this moment in front of your ghost.
My ghost? She swallowed. Well, I can't see him, and he isn't bothering me, so don't lose your chance. Cash leaned forward, sealing his lips to hers. Heat surged through her, melting her fatigue and shattering all worried thoughts unrelated to being close to Cash. She stepped closer to him, wrapping her arms around him as they deepened the kiss. He kept his hands unmoving on her hips, and she sensed restrained desire in his body language. When the kiss ended, Allison took a step back, even though she wanted another kiss, and probably more. So much for not seducing you. She licked her lips. I'm going to stop there. I didn't mean to make you violate a code of conduct you probably have as an investigator. That or make you wonder if I'm somehow manipulating you. And I certainly wouldn't want you to attribute it to some sense of obligation on my part for saving my life. For what it's worth, I've never kissed a man I've known less than 3 dates, much less one I've never dated. Cash tugged her back to him, but instead of another kiss, he touched his forehead to hers.
There are a lot of violations I want to commit with you right now. But we don't need to rush anything. We'll start with sleep, solving the case, and then you and I can see how far we want to take these sparks.
He ran a hand over her hair.
If and when we take that plunge, you won't sense any reluctance on my part.
I like your plan.
Using every ounce of her willpower, she stepped back.
Good night, Cash McCall.
Chapter 8. Cash took a cold shower. Allison Sloan was a passionate woman under her cool, professional exterior. Fortunately, she'd been able to access her rational brain in the heat of the moment, unlike Cash, who'd been teetering on the edge of losing control through the entire kiss. If she'd asked for more, he'd have given it to her. Consequences be damned. Instead, she'd listed the reasons why a passionate night together would be a bad idea, none of which were because she didn't want him. He took that as a good sign. But she'd missed one reason. Cash didn't want a one-night stand or anything fleeting, and he wouldn't get intimate until that expectation was clear. He dried off, wrapped the towel around his waist, and walked to the bedroom.
My daughter is not a one-night stand.
Cash startled.
Son of a spirit. Don't you respect personal boundaries?
Cash scolded Sloan in a harsh whisper, not wanting to wake Allison in the other room. Sloan crossed his arms, his semi-transparent form standing in front of a lamp, not casting a shadow.
She's not a one-night stand.
I heard you, and I agree with you.
Because if you think... Wait, what?
Cash pulled on a shirt. She isn't, and that's not what I want.
But you only just met her, and your track record...
Sloan protested. Is none of your business, Cash wanted to say, but that wouldn't shorten this conversation.
The McCalls have a long history of settling down later in life. We also don't take commitment lightly. So if you're wondering why I'm 38 and never married, it's because I only intend to do it once.
He grabbed boxers and shorts, walked into the bathroom, and closed the door 2/3 the way.
And before you get any ideas, I'm not saying I want to marry your daughter. I'm saying I want to go at something with substance. Well, what does that mean? It means I've known her less than 24 hours, so who knows what will happen.
He emerged from the bathroom, dressed for bed.
Besides, we have a murder to solve. You should be more worried about the threat the murderer poses to your daughter than the one posed by me.
The corners of Sloane's mouth fell.
I am. But you're the only one who can see and hear me, so I'm lashing out where I can.
Cash pulled the covers down on his bed.
Apology accepted. Now, your daughter is safe here, and I'm not going to sneak into her room like some insatiable teenager. So I need you and your sixth ghost sense to go spy while we get some rest.
Spy?
Sloan looked mortified, as though Cash had asked him to scrub public toilets.
Yes, spy.
Cash climbed into bed.
Flitter back and forth between the lab, the offices, and the police station. See what turns up.
I don't flit.
Transport, then.
You want me to spy on Detective LaGrange's work?
If you want me to stay one step ahead of the investigation into your daughter, yes. Hyde thinks I'm compromised because I like your daughter, and he's not wrong. But he won't share details with me now.
He never said that.
He didn't have to, but I can't solve the case if I'm missing pieces. Sloan crossed his arms, looking more like an insolent toddler than a respected lawyer.
Fine. I'll spy.
His mouth puckered in distaste. Thank you, counselor. Cash turned out the light and relaxed into the softness of his bed.
If you're serious about dating my daughter...
Sloane's voice dropped a conspiratorial octave.
How are you gonna get past the ghost thing? She'll never trust you, as long as you claim to see the supernatural.
I don't know how to overcome that obstacle,
but I won't lie to her, and I won't lie about my gift.
The next morning, Cash brewed coffee and tiptoed around his kitchen so as not to wake Allison. It occurred to him as he was falling asleep last night that he'd never brought a woman to his home. Nights with other women usually involved their place. It was one way he ensured they weren't lying about being married and enabled him to avoid awkward morning-after moments. Her father returned from his spying escapade.
Any news?
Cash asked.
Allison's research assistant was sneaking around the lab last night.
Curious. What'd Vera do after that?
I don't know. You said watch the lab, the offices, and the police station. I didn't tell anyone.
That smells amazing. Allison walked into the kitchen, with her hair a tangled mess and still in her yoga pants and t-shirt. Their fitted design hugged her chest and hips. Cash's only source of dissatisfaction was that he hadn't been the one to do that to her hair. But they'd made the responsible decision last night. Damn it. He poured Allison a cup of coffee and passed it along.
Sleep okay?
Yes, I thought I'd struggle with everything going on, but exhaustion took over.
Breakfast?
Coffee is my breakfast. She took a sip and gave a moan of delight that had him wondering if he could elicit such sounds from her. She caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the microwave door. Well, there isn't a side of me you haven't seen now. Composed in my office, working in my lab, falling to pieces as a suspect, taking my inhaler to avoid an asthma attack, nearly in tears after being shot at, and now this. Cash smiled.
All the facets that make you you. Perpetually polished people don't exist, and you're beautiful in all those roles.
She eyed him, disbelieving, over the rim of her mug. He considered showing her the attraction was genuine, but a murder case still loomed between them.
Do you need to finish that cup, or can I start talking shop?
Start talking, she replied.
Is there any reason Vera, your grad student, would be at the research lab in the middle of the night?
No.
No experiments on any timed cycle that would fall late?
No. Why?
Your phantom saw her at the lab last night.
Maybe she left personal effects and had to come back for them? Allison suggested.
No,
Sloan interjected.
the researcher was definitely searching for something.
Cash relayed to Allison.
T.S. seems to think Vera's activities were dubious, like she was searching for something.
You think she was looking for the little black book? Allison asked.
If she wanted to steal Balin's work, she couldn't do it with you there. It'd have to be after hours.
Allison bit her lip, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. Cash arched an eyebrow.
You aren't defending her, which means you think she might be capable of stealing?
No, I mean, it's just... Allison sighed. Vera is at the lab all of the time. Could Balin have been documenting work on my tumor specimens without her knowledge? I find that hard to believe. Allison took another sip of coffee as Cash watched her mind churn with questions and possibilities. He waited for her to continue. I wonder, did she know he was taking notes on my work and was too afraid to upset Rockstar PhD? Or was she in cahoots with him?
Cahoots?
That's the term, right? He nodded with a grin. Her detective mind was adorable. He also wasn't going to mention that she hadn't yet dismissed Vera being in the lab late at night as unsubstantiated hogwash from Cash's imaginary ghost.
Yeah.
He scratched the stubble on his jaw.
So, Vera's behavior last night sounds more like cahoots.
So, what do we do about it? Now that I have copies of the notebook, and she has nothing, she can't steal my work. I'm not sure how to get proof enough to fire her, though.
Allison.
He blinked at her several times.
Finish your coffee. You're missing the bigger picture here.
She gave Cash a puzzled look as she took another gulp. Cash leaned forward on the counter.
If Vera was working with Balin, she may have motive for murder.
What? Not Vera.
Does the name Techie25 mean anything to you?
Allison rubbed an ear. Not the entire name, but Vera went to Louisiana Tech and calls herself a techie sometimes. I wouldn't say definitively that could be her. Why?
Balin was texting someone by that name in a private chat room the night he was murdered. If he and Vera were stealing your work, maybe Vera found out Balin was going to apologize, and he threatened to tell you everything, effectually ending her career before it began. Maybe Vera got cold feet and she threatened to tell you. Except nothing at that crime scene looked like self-defense on the part of the murderer.
Allison added, and the apology note Balin started suggests he was the one growing a conscience. Cash took Allison's empty mug.
Why don't you get dressed, and we'll go talk to Detective LaGrange.
Allison flew through her bathroom routine and pulled on her jeans, a pink blouse, and her brown boots. Her mind was reeling. No way Vera could hurt anyone. She'd even said in her interview that she wanted to work in a lab that didn't torture and kill mice in the name of science. Allison had refrained from pointing out that mice research had advanced science in cancer therapy, understanding immune deficiency, and malaria treatments, to name a few. Mice research bore 17 Nobel Prizes and had saved millions of lives. Furthermore, if Vera had stabbed Balin, she'd have been doing so knowing he was taking blood thinners, and thereby knowing his risk of a fatal injury was high. With the morning sun streaming between concrete slabs, Allison and Cash walked through the parking deck to Allison's car. What the heck? Her car was lopsided, where someone had slashed her driver's side rear tire. Cash bent down to inspect the damage.
Balin's wife is in police custody, so this is someone else.
People really hate me. She pressed the key fob to unlock the trunk. I've got a spare tire.
Wait, Allison.
She opened the trunk and gasped at the sight of a knife covered in blood. She leaned closer. Is that the murder weapon? Beside the knife
lay an empty, opened jar she didn't recognize. A buzzing noise grew louder as a dozen bees flew out of the trunk. Allison screamed, backing up and turning, but too late. She felt the sting of several bees. No, no, no! She didn't have much time. She needed her EpiPen, and she always kept one in her purse. She grabbed for her purse on her shoulder, even as she felt her body's reaction to the bee venom. She knew the inflammatory cascade all too well. An IgE-mediated response of histamine. Blood pressure drop, throat swelling, asphyxiation. Cash was beside her.
Allison, what can I do?
But already she couldn't speak. She dug in her purse, but couldn't find the EpiPen. It was always there. She checked every month. Had someone moved it? She felt herself falling. Cash's strong arms helped lower her to the ground as he pleaded for her to tell him how to help her. She couldn't breathe. Then she was floating, a shapeless, bodiless form, looking down at her own pale, limp body. Cash gripped her shoulders.
Sloan, tell me what to do.
A man's baritone voice said,
Her backup epinephrine injection is in the glove compartment.
That voice! Allison knew that voice. In seconds, Cash had dashed to the car, retrieved the EpiPen, and removed the cap. He plunged it into her bicep, but she registered no pain.
Come on, baby. Come back to me. Is it working? Yes, but she needs rescue breaths.
Allison looked in the direction of the helping voice to see her father standing and looking down at Cash and her body. T.S. All this time, Timothy Sloan had been helping Cash, and Cash hadn't told her because he knew she'd never believe him. But as a spirit hovering above her own dying body, she could see and hear her father's ghost. Allison would have called out to both of them, but she had no voice. Cash pinched her nose, tilted her head, and breathed. Between breaths, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Between breaths, he gave the operator his location.
Stay with me, Allison.
With each breath, Allison felt herself tugged back into her body until she was resting peacefully, and all went dark and silent. Cash administered rescue breaths to an unconscious Allison. He'd taken basic life support classes every few years, so he knew the mechanics of how to perform resuscitation. Knowing the motions didn't keep fear from securing a vice-like grip around his gut. But Allison's chest rose and fell, so her throat hadn't completely closed off, thanks to the epinephrine. Her skin color reperfused, and her pulse, which she'd never lost, strengthened.
Vera's here.
Sloane's words sent spikes of ice down Cash's spine. Without leaving Allison's side, he glanced around, but didn't see anyone else in the garage.
Where?
Cash gave Allison another breath.
Lurking beside a car, a ways behind you. Too far for her to hear what you're saying. She's trying to decide if she's gonna risk coming after you to steal the book. Too far for her to hear what you're saying.
Cash glanced at Balin's little black book, which had spilled onto the floor near Allison's purse.
Is she armed?
He gave another breath.
Crowbar, from the trunk.
At least it wasn't a gun. His odds were better against a striking weapon, and he had the element of surprise. But he couldn't be detained fighting a vicious woman while Allison suffocated.
Okay, Sloan, you're gonna watch Vera like a hawk while I breathe for Allison. When that monster gets within 3 feet of us, I'm counting on you to let me know. I can do that.
His tone grew an even sharper, anxious edge. Cash continued to breathe for Allison, using all his willpower to trust Sloan to alert him to Vera. If he turned around too soon, he'd either scare her off and she'd get away, or he'd be drawn into a much longer confrontation, which Allison couldn't afford. If he turned around too late, well, he wouldn't be much good to Allison unconscious from a blow to the head.
Now!
Sloan shouted. Cash spun and lashed out as Vera stood with the crowbar drawn back over her head, looking as though she planned to come down on his head like an axe to wood. His foot struck her knee with a sickening crunch. Vera cried out as she crumbled to the floor, dropping the crowbar and clutching at her bent joint. Cash kicked the crowbar out of reach before turning back to Allison and giving another breath. He positioned himself on the other side of Allison so he could keep watch on Vera. The woman sobbed on the ground for a full minute before composing herself and trying to pull herself along the concrete away from the crime scene. She didn't get far before a black and white appeared, followed by an ambulance.
"What's going on here?"
the officers demanded.
"My name is Cash McCall. I'm a psychic detective with the NOPD. You can confirm that through Detective Hyde LaGrange. This is a crime scene. That woman attacked Allison Sloan, who I'm trying to keep alive."
One officer stood watch over Vera as the other called Detective LaGrange. When the paramedics climbed out of the ambulance with their medic bags, they did their assessment of Allison and used a mask attached to a bag and oxygen to breathe for her. Following another dose of epinephrine, she was breathing on her own. After starting an IV and running fluids into her vein, the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher and then into the ambulance. One took her ID from her purse as the other checked her blood pressure again. Cash started to join Allison in the back of the ambulance, but the paramedic beside her held up a hand.
"Are you family?"
No.
"I'm sorry, we can't take you with us."
The sobering words reminded Cash he needed to stay with the evidence anyway. Allison's father glided into the back of the ambulance, his expression somber.
"You're family to me. I'll stay with her,"
Sloan consoled Cash. The second paramedic shut the back doors and climbed up front. The ambulance drove off. Cash scrubbed his face and wiped tears from his eyes. He didn't have time to fall apart. He pulled out his phone and called Hyde. Sitting in Allison's driver's seat with his feet on the concrete floor of the parking garage, Cash put his head in one hand and held his phone to his ear with the other.
"I'm on my way,"
Hyde said. Cash relayed events to Hyde.
"I've got a forensics unit en route over there to process the knife. Nobody touched it?"
No. Cash pulled himself out of the seat and looked around. The officers had Vera cuffed in the back of their cruiser now.
"There are security cameras. We might catch Vera Myers in the act of planting the knife and bees."
Hyde gave a grunt.
"She had a time-stamped club pass as an alibi, but apparently that was by design. How is Dr. Sloan?"
"When you get here, I'm going to the hospital to check on her. You'll keep me posted?"
"Will do."
Chapter 9. Cash stood on the other side of the one-way glass, watching Vera Myers await interrogation. He'd gone to the hospital where Allison was in the ER getting medical attention and would be sent to the ICU for monitoring. Since he wasn't family, he wasn't allowed to see her. When he explained to the staff that she didn't have any immediate family, they assured him that she was one of their own and was in good hands. Annoyed at the circumstances, Cash brought his nervous energy to the police station and asked Sloan to give him updates about his daughter. Detective LaGrange entered the interview room and thanked a red-eyed, disheveled Vera for coming to the station. She glowered at him. Hyde went on to explain how Vera had been caught on security cameras planting the knife and bees in Dr. Sloan's car. While that was technically true, Cash had seen the dark footage with Hyde, and Vera's hoodie might make it difficult to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the perpetrator was her. However, she'd stayed at the crime scene, and her clothes were the same. The footage also caught her attacking Cash. Hyde, seeking a confession, not a trial, explained how all of the evidence proved Vera's guilt. Allison's father materialized beside Cash.
"Allison is doing well, under the circumstances. The doctors gave her fluids, steroids, and something called ranitidine. In the ICU, she'll be taken care of by health care providers who know her
and care about her.
Cash nodded, hands in his pockets, while keeping his gaze forward on the interview. Sloan spoke in his slow, sad tone.
I guess Vera moved the EpiPen from Allison's purse sometime yesterday, when Allison was in the lab or Balin's office. As for the trunk, Vera could have stolen a spare key from Allison's house. She house sat for Allison on occasion, watering her plants when she was away on conferences, so she knew the hidden outside key location.
Sloan gave a laborious sigh.
If I'd tailed her, I would have seen her plant the bees. You stayed lookout at the lab, which is what I asked you to do. Sneaking around a lab does not a murderer make,
Cash consoled him.
You would have known what to do. You're a good judge of character.
Cash didn't have a cheeky comeback, so he simply said,
Thank you.
In the interrogation room, Vera began to sob.
We had an agreement,
she snapped, her mood transitioning from sad to angry.
The professor agreed we were going to sell the lung organoids and the sustainable matrix for them. And then he backed out.
She shook her head, frayed blonde tips swinging.
We were going to miss out on millions of dollars because he grew a conscience.
What does a company want pieces of synthetically grown lung for?
Vera snorted at Hyde's apparent ignorance.
We had the ideal environment for implanting tumor cells. Once it was purchased and mass-produced, samples from all over the country could be implanted and grown, each paying patient with their own mini lung and preserved tumor. People would pay to have their tumor stored indefinitely so that molecular mutations could be tested at any time to determine future treatments.
Is there a big market for lung cancer?
Hyde asked. Vera gave him an incredulous stare.
It's the leading cancer in the United States. Lung cancer kills more people than breast, colon, prostate, and pancreas cancer combined.
So, pretty big?
Hyde asked calmly. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms.
So, you killed Professor Balin, but without his notes, you had nothing to sell.
He hid his notebook, and Dr. Sloan found it.
So, you went after Dr. Sloan. You planted bees, knowing she's deathly allergic.
Vera sniffed indignantly.
You have the footage, don't you?
I do, but you might feel better if you tell me how you killed Professor Balin and attempted to kill Dr. Sloan.
I want a lawyer.
Hyde leaned back with a fatherly smile.
No problem.
As he slowly stood, he pushed a legal pad and pen to her.
People usually feel better when they write things down. It gets it off their chest. I'll leave this here for you, in case you want to do that before your lawyer gets here.
Sloan, who'd stood beside Cash listening to Vera's questioning, vanished. Hyde left the interrogation room and walked around to the room where Cash stood. He clasped Cash on the shoulder.
Another one solved.
Vera stared at the paper before picking up the pen and starting to write. Cash felt a hollow sensation in the pit of his stomach. He wouldn't feel the success of this case until he saw Allison's healthy glow again. Hyde frowned.
Any word on the doctor? Her father says she's stable in the ICU. You like her, huh?
Cash turned toward Hyde.
Yeah, I like her.
Allison's father reappeared.
She's asking for you.
Cash straightened.
I gotta go, Hyde. You're leaving? You never miss the glorious confession.
But Cash was already out the door, bounding down the hallway. Allison looked around her hospital room at greeting cards and flowers from the staff. They'd amassed a collection in under a few hours. How strange it felt to be a patient in her own ICU. More than anything, though, she was grateful to be alive. Her body felt so exhausted, as if she danced the entire Nutcracker. Meanwhile, The steroids they'd pumped into her had her wanting to crawl out of her own skin. When she'd woken, she asked about Cash, but none of the ICU staff knew who or where he was, other than the news that he'd saved her life. She suspected he had a murderer to help catch. Vera. Sweet, studious Vera. Young, vibrant, and apparently deadly. Vera was one of the few people who knew of Allison's bee venom allergy. Allison flopped her head back on the bed. She wanted to see Cash, but had no way of reaching him. Even if she had her phone, she didn't have his number. "Dad?" She swallowed and blinked back tears. "If you're here, can you ask Cash to come see me?" 20 minutes later, Allison heard a knock at her door. A nurse poked his head in the room.
"Dr. Sloan, you have a visitor. Says he's with the police department. Name's Cash McCall."
"Yes, Dan, please let him in and add him to the visitor list."
Allison sat up straighter. She patted uselessly at her tangled mess of hair. 2 minutes later, Cash strode into the room, his smile lighting her world. He bent over and kissed her cheek.
So good to see you breathing on your own.
He pulled up a chair beside the bed and took her hand, careful not to disrupt her IV. He kept his gaze on their hands.
Vera is confessing. Everything will be wrapped up by the end of the day in terms of her arrest. She wanted to sell your lung organoids to a company that would cultivate people's tumors for a price.
He rubbed his thumb along the back of her hand.
"Cash?"
He didn't look up at first. Then he slowly raised his eyes to meet hers.
"Thank you for saving my life. And I'm infinitely grateful my father was there to tell you what to do."
Cash's eyes widened.
You know?
He stammered.
You saw?
"I've had the rare near-death patient tell me they were looking down at themselves during a code, watching their own resuscitation, and now I know what they were referring to. I sort of hovered, bodiless and speechless. I saw you and me, and I heard my father's voice talking to you."
He's been looking out for you.
"He's the one who told you I was innocent?"
Among other things.
Cash gave her a wry grin.
"I was pretty harsh on you about being a charlatan."
Comes with the territory. Besides, I took it as a challenge.
Cash's eyes sparkled.
I was winning you over, despite your disbelief.
Allison chuckled.
"Yes, you were."
He laid his head against her shoulder, saying nothing. She waited for him to share what was on his mind, but he remained uncharacteristically silent. She stroked a hand delicately through his hair.
"I can't tell if you're praying, sleeping, or communing with spirits."
I'm taking a moment to let the relief wash over me at seeing you well.
He lifted his head.
But I know you must be exhausted and need rest.
He started to stand, but reluctance slowed his motion.
"Cash?"
She gripped his hand before it slipped away.
"Now that I'm no longer a murder suspect."
Her nerve faltered.
She didn't want him to leave without knowing how she felt.
But was the ICU after a nearly fatal event really the time to ask him out? Cash sat back down with an amused curve of his lips.
I'd like to date you, Allison. And not that I have any way to prove it to you, but your father says he thinks he could tolerate me in your life.
Allison laughed. That sounds like him. Chapter 10. 12 months later. Cash watched Allison walk down the aisle, looking drop-dead gorgeous in her white silk gown. The sparkling embroidered top seemed to enhance her sapphire eyes. She wore her rich brown hair in an updo, with teasing curls framing her face. Her gaze never left his.
She's a dream come true,
Cash said. He intended the comment for Allison's father, though the priest beside him nodded.
You deserve each other,
Sloan said, wiping at his eyes as his figure shimmered near where Allison would soon stand.
I'm delighted she found her match.
Her father had insisted on remaining a lingering spirit long enough to see them wed. He promised he would move on after their happy day. Over the last year, Cash had been the intermediary between Sloan and his daughter, helping repair the father-daughter relationship. But it was time for her father to let go, and Allison needed the final closure too. Vera Myers was doing time upstate. Balin's wife was charged with a misdemeanor. When Vera's confession went public, Balin's wife sent Allison a letter of apology. All the same, Allison filed a restraining order against her. Allison had looked into the company wanting to buy her lung organoids to grow tumor cells. She sold her organoid patent with a clause that a % of all proceeds the company made from use of the design would go toward further lung cancer research. She kept the rights to use her own cellular microenvironment to further research in the field. Cash scanned the crowd of wedding attendees. His family and friends watched in silent awe as Allison walked the aisle. Hyde LaGrange was in the second row on the groom's side. Allison had coworkers and friends filling her side of the church. His bride met him at the altar with a beaming smile. Cash took Allison's hands.
You know, if you'd had an alibi that day, I might never have stayed long enough to get to know you.
I'm glad I didn't have an alibi.
The priest cleared his throat and projected his voice.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today.
I do,
Allison interrupted.
I do too,
Cash said. Sloan let out a sigh.
You're supposed to wait until the priest asks if you do.
Cash leaned in and kissed his wife. The end.